A very warm welcome to everyone on day 2 of the International Conference on Women Across Geographies, Issues and Perspectives. Now I request the chair and the speaker for session 5th to kindly take their respective seats as we begin the proceedings for the session on widow remarriage, tradition, taboo, and transformation. The chair for this session is Dr. Ranjana Kumari, Founder Director, Center for Social Research, New Delhi. The speakers are Dr. Rai Ganguly, Assistant Professor, UPES Dehradun, Professor Mary A. Negoyas, Professor of Religious Studies, East Carolina University, USA, and Dr. Saradamoyee, By Fellow and Director of Studies in the Land Economy, Lucy Cavendish College, University of Cambridge, UK. She'll be joining us shortly. Professor Ebenezer was supposed to join us online, but due to bad health, he won't be joining us for the session. The chairs will get 5 minutes each to make opening and closing remarks. Speakers will get 15 minutes each.
More agency, they're getting empowered. Society is moving. But when you look at some of these issues and traditions, also there is a change. I will not say that there is no change in Indian society in terms of choices given to women. But because India is not just one single whole in terms of kind of culture, kind of people who are living different levels of in society, different levels of culture, different levels of socio-economic life. So that's something, when it depends on where you are looking at, which population you are looking at of the country. So certainly caste, class, gender, all matters even in this particular issue, not only. So intersectionality is certainly here when you look at the issue of widow remarriage. Not that society, and also when you look at the way we treat our women, basically in smaller city town, things have not changed as much. In rural areas, is going to take another 100 years perhaps before we can really see the transformation. The thing that at least I have devoted 50 years of my life working on women's empowerment. So I think that's something very important to understand, that widow remarriage remains an issue in our country. And also that, this session that you've organized, I'm very happy, and it's my privilege to be here this morning. We had 2 day very, very important engagement. We were talking about trust and safety. So here we are talking about AI, and here we are still wondering that after losing husband, does women have the dignity? Does she have the right, equal right to property and share and also to get the economic social support to rebuild her life? Does she have the right to love, to marry someone again? Or does she have a choice to remain alone if she wants to? So this is basically the question of agency and choice when it comes to women's lives and their own decision. And that is where widow remarriage has got somewhere stuck in terms of our social psyche. That we are not looking at how women are really going to live their life, if they have children, who's going to support, if she is economically dependent, she has been economically dependent, and if she's a young widow. There were traditions in certain societies, and we continue to, practice those, especially certain parts of Haryana, Rajasthan, Western UP. When we did our study, widow, abandoned and destitute women, it was, in fact, headed by the then women's movement leader Pramila Dandwate, and she shared it with Pramila and Jamila Varghese, one of the most prolific researcher and writer of her times. So I think, and I was of course a young Jawaharlal Nehru University researcher who joined the team to get them the information and the data. So I feel that it's important to see that we are not, there is a movement in society. No societies are, and social change is a process. It happens, things are changing, but this is when we had the law in, I think, 1856, when we passed the law for widow remarriage, the movement by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a very, very well-known social reformer and social change leader in our country. So, law came in 1856, and we are talking about widow remarriage in 2025, and still we are seeing it as an issue and a problem. I mean, it's about a century. Why it takes so much for effecting any kind of change for women's lives? Well, so remarriage, sadly, the answer is very uncomfortable still. I am very glad that you all are here to discuss this whole issue, and also that we have an international presence here, and some of our societies are still in the same framework, in the same way. They're looking at men-women relationship, they are looking at opportunities for women, and also empowerment of women is at different stages in our society, different levels. It's not really achieved. Every woman has not, it has not touched the shores of our villages, I can say that. Still it is outside. And in spite of work going on, in spite of so much of emphasis, so many programs have been rolled out. But when you go to places like, so we still have Vrindavan, we still have Varanasi. Why I'm naming these cities? Because these are the cities centers where people, when they want a widow to get rid of a widow, not to give her any property right, not to let her be there, and still consider that widow remarriage is a kind of social stigma, and they don't want the women to start their life again. So those are the places where they take these old women, and we have a whole government program supporting those women. We recognize the problem, and we have also made a kind of still in any kind of religious function, any kind of important social, I think in Delhi talking about it is very important, because a lot of our younger generation has not understood this, how rest of the society is living. So it's very, very important that we discuss this issue. So let me not take too much of your time. I only want to flag one more issue, that patriarchy and poverty gels together here. Patriarchy, so you don't give women any right. Patriarchy, so she is not given the same status as men. The entitlement to property is with them, with men, and women are not given that entitlement. And also poverty. So that means that a lot of people who are living in, you can say, I would say subhuman conditions, but now it's becoming better, because we are really reaching some kind of services through government to every household in India. So, but then people who are living in poverty, and also who are and economic deprivation, these issues become much, much stronger. So when we talk about 900 million people having access to internet in our country, we still have 500 million who don't have access, which may be, perhaps many nations of Africa put together, many nations of Europe put together. So I think those are the people who are neglected, that's where most of our women, and widow remarriage is a challenge. A lot of people in the urban centers, still educated girls have that choice, they are able to force their choice, but not in the areas which are, and also as I said, certain caste issue, that certain caste, it is absolutely big no. So when I wrote my book Brides Are Not for Burning, one relationship I could see very clearly for not marrying off the women again, second time, because they were not willing to spend the same amount of dowry, same amount of marriage expenditure the second time. So that was also in a way really stopping the families to go ahead, and first of all to find a match, because in our society it's not that you choose for majority. Again I'm not making a kind of generalized statement, because Indian society is going through a huge transformation at the moment. We are modernizing, we are making choice, a lot of women are getting agency, but for the majority of the population, still the challenges are there. So now let me start by just posing three questions. That should women be recognized as citizen and with full rights, equal rights, whether they are, and women as women, not women as widow women, married women. How many people do you say he's a widower? Do we say it to men? He's a widower. I mean, very soon we forget that he had a wife and he lost the wife and he's moving. But widow remains written here. One of my professor in Jawaharlal Nehru University, very forward-looking professor, Professor Dr. Bhamri. I was a political science student and now I work as a political scientist. I think it's important. He used to ask me this question, why widow? Why don't you women fight and say, this is not a, I mean, I am a woman and a woman. I am Ranjana Kumari. I am like, any other person in society. How that losing someone in life who I may have loved, whom I may not have loved, who may have been inflicting all kinds of violence on me all my life, psychological, physical, or whatever. Losing him, how do I lose my identity and I become widow? So this whole idea needs to be challenged. The concept of widowhood. Why widowhood? Okay, you lost your husband. That's the status. Why widow? So that itself needs to be understood. Why in women's life it gets written. He used to always say, "ये सिर पे माथे पे लिखा हुआ है क्या कि आप widow हैं? मतलब इसका क्या है?" तो ये this is something which also. So I want to also say that should they have recognition and equal right, and also because this is not just a moral question anymore. Actually, it is a social test. If you look at, if the women are not treated and given the agency, then it is a social test to look at where your society is, at what level of development your society is, how much your women are empowered. So I think that's something. Should we consider these kind of issues as really putting to test our society, where our women are faring? So thank you. I have a lot more to say, but I know that I'm not here to speak. I'm only chairing this session. So I will limit my comment and let's start with you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ranjana Kumari, for ushering me in here with those encouraging and thoughtful remarks. A very good morning to my fellow researchers, our most gracious organizer whose unparalleled hospitality we have been enjoying for the past couple of days. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to be here sharing my research work in this academic milieu, and I hope that it will find its way out of this boardroom and reach the thousands for whom it is meant for. And I speak to come up with solution and action. So my presentation is titled Remarriage and Retention of Property, a critical analysis of widows' inheritance rights in contemporary India. And it explores how widowhood continues to sit at the intersection of tradition, taboo, and transformation, and how the question of property remains central to this negotiation. So I look at three underlying factors to my presentation. These are: widowhood is that phase in the life cycle of a woman when she has social and legal sanction to property. And widows have been has been a central problematic figure in granting women property rights. And third, widow remarriage is an issue unique to Hindu widows. So these are the agendas. I look at the historical legal framework a little thoroughly, and it refers to the advent of the Anglo-Hindu law in the Indian subcontinent in 19th century. Next, I come to widow remarriage and expound its link to property rights of Hindu women. Third, I shift the focus 100 years later to post-colonial India and its engagement with women's rights, with widow at the center stage, following her legal and social fate as a singularly problematic figure in women's property rights domain. Next, I discuss a case law and a case study from two eastern neighboring states of Jharkhand and West Bengal. And I discuss two tribal widows' rights. And I discuss these rights from customary and statutory laws angle. I also look at SDGs, particularly SDG 5 and 10, to understand the legal thrust towards bringing about gender justice globally. And finally, I conclude with an understanding of what makes laws work in making widows inherit property and not the other way around. Like, we look at why laws are not working. Today, I'm also looking at what is making these laws work. So I veer away from the have-not widows and to those widows and focus on those widows who have made use of laws to gain property by becoming landowners. So let me begin by asking, why do laws not work? What stops them from reaching the grassroots, the target audience? And conversely, how do marginalized women challenge the lofty structure of law, the legal language, and to make it responsive to their lived realities? I see that the opening line of the concept note also focused on the legal and cultural and economic and political structures, and the legal structure is very important. So this paper will follow India's legal system as a site of gender justice and redistribution of wealth, where questions of inheritance, morality, and ownership continue to reflect a deeper logic of patriarchal control. So widowhood in South Asia, from a historical context, has long been synonymous with a social death, a condition marked by economic exclusion and social invisibility. As Beena Agarwal reminds us, owning arable land, that is agricultural land, enhances a widow's bargaining power. Yet, paradoxically, she remains the most dispossessed classes of landholders. So the first major intervention in the life of a widow was in 1829 with the Prevention of the Sati Act, ostensibly to abolish widow's immolation, which is burning herself at the funeral pyre of the husband. But the underlying factor was it also responded to a fiscal anxiety. A widow was a surplus in the imagination of the family. So they did have shastric injunctions to maintenance and property, and their elimination, that is the widow's elimination, whether it was literal or symbolic, restored patriarchal control over inheritance, which is private property, so that it stayed in the same family. The next reform was Widow Remarriage Act of 1856. It seemed revolutionary, but the emancipatory potential was compromised by a critical caveat introduced in the preamble of the law. Widows who remarried had to forfeit their deceased husband's property. Now, this was meant for the upper caste and class widows, the remarriage, right? So Flavia Agnes and Lucy Carroll show the Section 2 of the 1856 Act entrenched property disinheritance, protecting upper caste wealth, while excluding widows from lower non-property holding castes. The 1889 Allahabad High Court case of Harsaran Das versus Musammat Nandi, involving a sweeper woman dispossessed of just 2 kathas of land, of deceased husband's land after this act came into the being. It illustrates how law itself became the instrument of exclusion. So reformers like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, the man behind the 1856 widow remarriage, turned to Shastric texts to legitimize widow remarriage, arguing it was never forbidden in the Hindu dharma. Yet both sati and social death that followed widowhood conformed to upper caste sensibilities, aiming to deny women autonomy through inheritance. Widow remarriage was prevalent amongst lower castes. And they also retained property. They went hand in hand. But with the 1856 Act, it became prohibited for everybody because it was aimed to preserve wealth amongst the Brahmins where it mattered the most. So morality, chastity, and property were folded into a single patriarchal logic. Now coming to, sorry, that was my next slide. But now coming to post-independence, the Hindu Succession Act marked a turning point in 1956, like exactly 100 years later. It abolished the widow's estate. It was a Victorian life interest model introduced by the colonial law. And 1956 The widow was made into a class 1 heir with ownership rights equal to sons. It also removed chastity as a ground for inheritance. But again, as Agnes and Agarwal show and note, that this progress was partial. Daughters still didn't have rights to joint family property. And it was only in 2005 amendment to the Hindu Succession Act of 1956 that daughters finally had a right to claim for partition of joint family property and household. Right? So, moreover, the colonial codification of law had already eroded earlier forms of women's ownership, such as Tridhan, once women's exclusive right to immovable property under Mitakshara jurisdiction, by reducing it to the stigmatized practice of dowry, which is about movable property that can be given to women. So, with that background, I come to the modern legal landscape. Now it is global rights. So SDG 5 looks at gender equality, whereas SDG 10 is trying to reduce inequality within and among countries. And land inequality is one of the foremost things that should be under consideration here, in my humble opinion. But SDG 10 is again one of the least implemented of the goals, right? So it is. Why is that? Is because precisely property and land in particular continues to be masculinized capital. So legal reform alone cannot suffice. Laws must converse with culture, property with power. The question remains, can widowhood as a site of social and economic exclusion become central to achieving gender justice under SDG frameworks? So now I come to the complexities. Okay, I'll quickly go over these slides. Indian legal architecture actually divides land rights into two spheres. The first is private property, which is governed by the Hindu Succession Act. It's a central act, right? Agricultural land falls under the federal structure. So in every state, land as property or agricultural land is governed by state land reform acts. By state, I mean province. Right? So the FRA and the LARR do not conform to the Central Succession Act, which is the Hindu Succession Act of 1956. They have a different law of devolution. So I'm not going into these. This duality creates contradictions. While widows may inherit under the Hindu Succession Act, state laws often prioritize ownership through labor rather than lineage. Inheritance is through lineage. Ownership right of agricultural land is through able-bodied producer. So such bifurcation, as Nitya Rao argues, leads to selective application of legal principles, marginalizing tribal and working class women who rely on land for livelihood rather than wealth. Federal complexities, I've already mentioned, central law versus state land reforms, agricultural land under state jurisdiction. There have been a lot of effort in present India, like these are the ones, the 5-year plans and Niti Aayog stamp duty that increase women's ownership. But I come to a case law, which is in 1981. This contradiction of private property and agricultural land is evident in the landmark Madhu Kishwar case. A tribal widow from the Ho community, Makubai, challenged the Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act, you can see it's from 1908, which limited widows' maintenance rights and denied them inheritance. The Supreme Court upheld customary law, refusing to apply Hindu personal law to tribal communities, thus affirming community autonomy but denying equality. As Deo observes, this judgment marked a steady erosion of tribal women's rights. So we actually talk about laws as giving rights, wherever if you unpack them, you look at how tribal rights have been constantly eroded. And these are rural agrarian women whose work is on the fields, right? So from life interest, it has come down to maintenance and thence to total exclusion. I come to West Bengal. This was from Jharkhand, Makubai. The Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act is in the eastern state of Jharkhand, a tribal state, culled out from Bihar because of its tribal nature. And West Bengal, I argue, because of its Land Reforms Act, which were like most ably introduced. That's debatable, but for the sake of this presentation, let's go with it. In contrast, it presents a most enabling legal landscape, at least. This is my hypothesis, and I went to do my ethnography on the basis of this. So the West Bengal Land Reforms Act of 1955 recognizes adult, unmarried women as eligible cultivators. and allows one registered heir per plot, preventing land fragmentation through inheritance and enabling widows to inherit directly. So combined with the Hindu Succession Act, this creates a double beneficiary model, because the Land Reforms Act and the Central Succession Act comes together, offering both inheritance based on equality within the family and labor-based inheritance entitlement based on work. So the celebrated Operation Barga in 1978 further secured the cultivators' rights through oral verification, did away with papers, and later digitization of land records, the record of rights, enhanced tenure security. Now, tenure security is again another whole ballgame altogether. Like the Prindex survey looks at this. Sorry, I don't have a pie chart, but I'll quickly come to my ethnographic study of Moni Tudu, a Santhal tribal widow. My 2018 fieldwork in Birbhum district of West Bengal in several blocks revealed how both the Central Succession Act and the state law operate in tandem. One widow, Moni Tudu, actually went to the Block Land and Land Reforms Office to register herself as a landowner and fought a protracted legal battle to reclaim 3.5 acres of her late husband's land after being forcibly evicted by upper caste landowners. So despite formal entitlement, which was what the Prindex survey looks at, she was accused of failing to cultivate a common patriarchal pretext to delegitimize women's tenure. Her persistence turned her into what Wiley calls a litigious subject, a woman who must mobilize law itself to prove belonging. So Moni's case shows registration of land in one's name formalizes rather than creates property. Property is created through labor, right? And that the social imagination of widows as incapable cultivators remain a barrier as powerful as law. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation. I hope I'm within time. And basically, we have seen taboo, tradition, and transformation, but from the colonial caveat to the 1856 law, which disinherited working class women from property rights to ex-husband's property, to today's inheritance barriers, we see a reconstitution of taboos. Both rest on the same logic that women's economic autonomy threatens lineage purity and male control, where once remarriage disqualified widows from inheritance, now, custom and community interests serve similar ends. And these are not vestiges of tradition. These are active technologies of exclusion sustained through what I call socioeconomic hotspots. So, where intersections of law, morality, and local economies reproduce patriarchal norms. So, now my solution. To conclude, land rights remain the cornerstone of gender equality. Upper-class women frame their claim through inheritance within the family and equality. Working class and tribal women through livelihood and belonging. The logic of property is you can alienate it, you can sell and mortgage it. So land continues to be defined narrowly like that, either as a marketable asset or as private property. Even agricultural land goes through that, as Maki Bui and Moni Tudu show. They're going through the logic of alienation. I can alienate it, therefore I have absolute right to property. But I look at tribal and marginalized women's right to land, and you have to redefine it as somewhere women want to belong to. They want to sustainably produce, create wealth that sustains them. They don't want to sell that land. They want to belong to it. So it's that way land will be a site of social reproduction and sustainability. Cases like Maki Bui and Moni Tudu remind us that women's right to land are not just about ownership that considers the male patriarchal logic of right to alienate. Instead, working agrarian women's rights have to be seen through the right to belong, that of continuity and dignity even after husband's death. So in short, right to livelihood comes before right to property, and that is the 1955 Land Reforms Act's agenda. Like, right to property is not a fundamental right, but right to life and hence livelihood is. To move forward, India's states must afford differentiated, locally grounded policies, and I think widowhood offers an excellent lens to judge this by. It recognizes women's productive labor, strengthen land retention and not sell and alienation, and bridges the interface between family and property law. Only then can widowhood be reimagined not as a social death, but as a site of rights, resilience, and reform. Thank you. Thank you for the extra time, I think.
So clearly, the paper presented shows the connect between patriarchal control over property, rationalized in the name of social custom, and keeping women away. In spite of so many layers of legislation, Supreme Court judgment, still women do not exercise that right. And that's, I think, her conclusion. And I feel that is extremely important to understand that all the social stigma, taboos, everything is to protect the land rights held by men in our societies. And that's something. To transfer land, women had to, all the 2 case studies, they had to go to the court, fight the cases, and to be able to get, in spite of the fact that now Supreme Court says that inheritance, wherever there is inherited land or property, it has to be equally divided between men and women. That includes the single women rendered due to death of the husband. So instead of calling widow, I would say single women who are rendered alone or single, or choose, or they, and the choice should be there whether they want to be single or they want to, again marry. So that choice should be there, and also that they are the ones who are really denied the right to property, whether it is land or any other asset. So now let me call upon and hear the whole status and what is happening in other part of the world. And I would call Dr. Mary to speak. Thank you.
So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this very wonderful conference. So my name is Mary Nyanhweso, and I'm from Kenya, Africa. Even though I'm based in the United States, where I've been for a very long time, but I still care so much about Africa. So the topic for today is the taboo of widowhood in Africa. And I call it taboo because of we're going to see why. So when we talk about, did I touch the wrong thing? So what I'm going to do is essentially try to just introduce the topic, which is, of course, widowhood, and, of course, the challenges that come with widowhood in Africa. What I like about with this conference is looking at widowhood as something that essentially is experienced in different cultures, and yet there is that commonality in the experiences, and that's why this is really a good conference to try and look at what is it that makes us women in terms of experiencing certain aspects of life in a similar way. And then I'll be giving examples. My research essentially draws from narrative stories, anthropological approaches, where I hear and project the voices of people who've gone through this particular experience. And then I'm going to look at the moral dilemma regarding what culture is all about, versus what is supposedly right, and the dilemma that women have to go through in trying to balance that too. And then, of course, we're going to look at some of the recommendations that I have. I like to start with data, because data really tells us the story. When we talk about widows, people tend to think that just, who are these? But when you look at the data, it probably tells you that these are significant population of people who live in this society, very important people. Of 258 million widows globally, 129 million reside in Africa. About half of the world's widows, essentially. 1 in 10 African women are widowed. All right, and that tells you something about the experience. In Kenya, where I come from, we have about 8 million widows, and they comprise about 15% of the population. In Nigeria, it's about the same, 7 to 15 million widows in that particular. And I can go on and look at other countries as well in terms of data. But so my presentation today aims to highlight what widowhood as a status means for the African woman. And I'm going to look at examples from select communities to kind of make my point. And then, of course, look at specific challenges that they go through in terms of looking at the similarities, in terms of what a woman in Kenya is going through versus a woman in South Africa is going through in terms of widowhood. And then, of course, I'll go over the pointers that I mentioned earlier. But in a summary form, we can say widows tend to go through similar experiences. The first one is invisibility. People don't talk about them. And we're going to see when you become a widow, you become taboo. You're not supposed to be talked about. And there are cultures that essentially makes you invisible. You become an entity. We're going to look at how they are socially isolated. And we are going to look at some of the challenges of that in terms of economic vulnerability and the health vulnerabilities that they encounter. And of course, we're going to look at how culture and especially religious values sanction some of these cultural practices. So invisibility, to start with that, in Kenya, widows are not even counted in the census. You know, we represent every other group, but the widows were not represented until, of course, we started making the noise. Until 2019, they started recognizing and counting the widows. That is a very significant point in terms of invisibility. You know, they don't really matter. Among the South Africans, the Bapedi community, widows must move out of the way when they meet people. So you can essentially dodge people because you are widowed, all right? She's forbidden from visiting neighbors. She cannot attend family functions. She cannot arrive at home late in the night. She must sit in the back because she's not supposed to be seen. That's what I call invisibility. I think that's the same slide. When we talk about social isolation, we're going to see that most of the communities in Africa tend to have some kind of stigma associated with the widow. You know, she's usually considered impure. Because your husband died, you become impure. They assume to carry omens of death. Because your husband died, then you carried the responsibility of that death. They suffer loneliness because of that. They are ostracized, and they are blamed sometimes for their husband's death. And so for that reason, because they are perceived to be impure, they have to be cleansed. So we have this common ritual that during my research I found is found in Kenya and South Africa and West Africa. All these communities practice what we call sexual cleaning before interaction with other members of the community. You have to go through some certain cultural practices to be purified so that you can connect back with members of the community. And alongside that, there are cultural practices such as property grabbing. Now, property grabbing goes along, of course, with the ritual cleansing. But property grabbing is essentially because a woman essentially is a property of the man. So when the man dies, she is property. So she has to be distributed to other members of the community. Quite often the brothers or the cousins, or there are certain individuals in the community, if the brothers are not their cousins, who are supposed to take over and take you over as property. Ritual cleansing, which is a very common practice, goes alongside with widow inheritance or levirate practices. There's a justification for that culturally in most of these cultures, or it's supposed to help you heal, you know, during a grieving process. It removes that bad luck that you have and misfortunes that surround you. So you have to go through these rituals. It serves as the tie between you and your husband, because, you know, the ghost of the husband has to be exorcised. And for the ghost to be exorcised, you have to go through ritual. You have to be cleansed, you know, like this picture of this woman, she has to shave her hair as a one way to remove the impurities that were brought through death. And compliance to ritual cleansing is proper grieving. Proper grieving, depending on who defines what is proper grieving. And so you have to cut your hair as a way to do that. Now, because of property, grabbing, taking everything that belonged to the man, women go through a lot of economic vulnerabilities. Disinheritance and property grabbing practices lead to a lot of poverty among these widows. And studies have actually been done on this to show that 75% of widows get disinherited in Africa, which means this is a real story. Now, I like to voice women's voice. In Zimbabwe, there's Martha who says, "In the midst of my mourning and confusion, my elder brother-in-law was running around taking the car keys and all the important documents in the house. I was forced to go through sexual cleansing ritual with my late husband's elder brother to remove the bad spirits of my husband. The thought of HIV and AIDS scared and terrified me when I was told I was going to have this sexual cleansing rite with the cousin of my late brother." And in Africa, of course, you have no control over sexual advances. It's essentially you have to oblige. Now, it doesn't matter how educated you are. There's this narrative here from Ghana where we have Peggy Appiah, and I wrote this in my publication in 2017. Appiah married a white woman and thought that the white woman is protected. He was Christian and wrote a will and left a will that he does not want those rituals performed for the wife. But it did not work. When Appiah died, the wife had to go through those rituals. There was a lot of drama in the home as members wanted to perform those rituals for the woman, the white woman, right? And the will was disregarded as to what Appiah himself wanted. His son had to intervene and try to protect the mother. It took the president of the country to come and intervene for this woman to be left the property that Appiah had left in that particular instance. So property grabbing happens regardless on whether you are educated or not. In Nigeria, very close to Ghana, we have the same ritual being performed here. And in fact, a widow is known as Nanywi Insimpe, which means a woman without a head, because the head of the family is the man. So when he dies, the woman doesn't have a head. So for that reason, you have to go all through these rituals. And the ritual cleansing sometimes involves certain really risky practices, like they have to wash the corpse of the dead, and the woman has to drink of the water that was used to cleanse the body. And that's the only way you are going to demonstrate to the community that you did not kill your husband. And that's the only way you get cleansed. And of course, again, you are allowed to stay for 5 years without getting married because, that is the culture. So many stories like that. In Zimbabwe, similar story. Before my husband was buried, I was accused of bewitching him. I was told that if I refused to go through the sexual cleansing rite, then I would have to leave the family house and everything. My husband's family were of the opinion that I would get married within the family. They pointed out that since they had already paid the bride price and I had 3 children, so these children must be raised within the family, the family. And that's one of the justifications for why you have to be married by the brother. You cannot go elsewhere and look for somebody else. Now, going back to my country, Kenya, there was another very, again, renowned story about this woman. Every culture has ethnic communities. And there is the Luo community that practices rituals, these cleansing rituals. And this Luo man, who was essentially an attorney, married a woman from the Kikuyu community who lived in Nairobi, and they believed they were modernized, so nothing was going to affect them. when it comes to these traditional practices. But when the husband died, she had to go through those rituals. She resisted because she was more educated. She was essentially represented feminism in Kenya. She resisted that, but the president of the country decided to side with the man and insisted that the property that belonged to the attorney be taken away from her. And so there was a very huge tussle between that. The law believed that, if you do not comply, then you are going to be cast. You get Shira, and if you get Shira, they believe that it's going to kill you. And if you're more educated, you probably think, that is not going to happen. But if you're not educated, you actually believe these things to be true. Now, getting to the part where religion sanctions these practices, this is where it gets tricky, because religion is sacred. And because it is sacred, we tend to believe everything that it says. In indigenous religious practices of most African communities, they believe that death causes certain impurities. When someone dies, the spiritual world is stirred. And when it is stirred, that's why the widow has to go through this ritual to restore the normalcy within the spiritual world. And so there is the justification, explanation for why you have to go through these rituals. Otherwise, other people are going to die, maybe the family members are going to die. And that becomes one way in which culture and religion coerces a widow to go through these particular practices. But Africa, I would want to say, was fortunate to get other foreign religions like Christianity and Islam. But interestingly, they have the same theology that essentially justifies patriarchy against the widows. In Christianity, you can see Isaiah talks about widowhood as a sign of degradation. All right, the book of Genesis 38 talks of childless widows being bequeathed to the brother. So they do the same thing. Now, this is the Jewish tradition transferred to Africa, which is essentially similar. Essentially, the brother has to marry the widow. In Leviticus 21, high priests were discouraged from even marrying a widow, which means you become a widow, you stay a widow forever. So this is part of what has been brought to Africa with regard to religions continuing to sanction behavior that essentially undermine widowhood. Now, of course, health vulnerability becomes another area where exposure to these sexual activities with men you don't even know about has led to a lot of widows contracting HIV, AIDS, and other STIs. And of course, the psychological trauma that comes with that is unbelievable. Studies show that essentially most women become mentally ill because of the trauma, and some of them have these reproductive health issues that go with that. I'm just about finished. Okay, in the 2 minutes, I'll finish that. This is the most important part with regard to the human rights component about what culture is and what is supposedly right. Now, there's these arguments between cultural right, it's our culture, this is what we do, nobody should come and tell us what we should do, versus the moral universalism, which essentially supports human rights, and it's always perceived to be a Western view that is being imposed on this culture. But for me, at what point do we ask ourselves when a culture is problematic? You can mourn the way you want to mourn, but when it becomes problematic, when it exposes you to health issues, to economic vulnerabilities, then it becomes an issue. And so it doesn't matter which side you stand, I believe you should be able to question and reflect on questions like that. So recommendations, just to finish. Widowhood is a human condition. Let's not blame the widows for husband's death. Let's find a way of protecting widows and empower their agency, as was already indicated, without intimidating them and, of course, traumatizing them, using culture and religion to justify that. Let's criminalize and enforce laws that protect widows from harmful practices. the religions that tend to sanction widowhood mistreatment, they have the ethics of care. Now, all the scriptures have teachings about caring for those who are vulnerable in the communities. Why don't we embrace that? Why don't we use that and protect the widows instead of harming them? Thank you so much for listening.
So I think story is almost the same, maybe in certain ways. In the name of culture, the injustices inflicted on women for centuries continues. So I would call now Dr. Saradamoyee to make her presentation. Please make it brief so we can have some time for discussion. I'm sure people have questions.
Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me here in this very rich atmosphere of intellectual thoughts. I'll try my best to present my thoughts, and please pardon my very bad voice. I suddenly got a very severe cold yesterday. But my job is slightly easier because of my various two speakers before me, Rai, and that they have already gave a detailed explanation of India and Kenya. And in my presentation, I'll also include Nepal, and I will look at from a capability lens in my presentation. So that is my roadmap of my presentation: brief introduction, then the theoretical framework, then going individually to individual countries of India, Nepal, and Kenya. Yes, we have been already, you know, that there are 258. To give a bit of background, my research on widows. So last year, funded by the Lumba Foundation, I did a 11 country study on the widows, especially on the impact of International Widows Day, which was established by UN due to the constant effort by the Lumba Foundation. And so we looked at the policy gaps in 11 countries. And among those 11 countries were India, one of the three countries, India, Kenya, and Nepal. So losing a partner, as we know, is a life-changing event, but it's always a differentiating impact on women. And although there are 258 million, we do not have more than updated data more than this. We have 258 million widows, but as we all know, because of the civil war, especially natural disasters and our recent pandemic, the figure is constantly rising. So we looked at this study from SDG 5, the Gender Equality Framework, because of the large section of widows being vulnerable to poverty, distribution, and violence. And so we should give an urgent attention to their experience, because if such a large section of widows are left behind, then we can never reach the gender equality goal of the UN. So, advantage of remarriage: it is expected to improve our overall quality of life, but it is also a choice. Marrying or not marrying is a choice. So, if I look at sense capability approach, it is about expanding choices, but several factors influence this choice. So, sense approach has three key aspects: functionings, capabilities, and agency. So functions are beings and doings. For example, be secure, being respected, being educated, and having the real freedoms in life to be secure, to be respected, to be educated, to have a gainful employment, and how much agency a person would have to make that choice and living a life of value. So primarily 4 capabilities we are looking at in this presentation: legal capability, whether how much freedom a widow would have to remarry without having the fear to losing rights, freedom to, especially economic and inheritance rights. Then economic capability, inheritance, property, and right to livelihood. Then social and cultural, even if she has the right to remarry, social stigma reduces her agency to make meaningful choices. And their physical and emotional well-being. We have already, my esteemed speakers have talked about several harmful rituals which would undermine the bodily integrity and emotional well-being. So now I will proceed to individual country analysis. As you have been already told that widow remarriage was especially campaigned by our very eminent social reformer, Ishchandra Vidyasagar, and who, especially what is so very important and enlightening about his campaign was he wanted to lead by example, because even after the act was enacted, there was no one to marry a widow. So the groom became Ishchandra Vidyasagar's son, and the bride was a 14-year-old girl whose husband died 10 years earlier. But reality, as we all know, remarriage is more of an exception than a trend. Although I must say that this trend is changing, especially among the younger widows. Around 30 years of age, there is a study in southern India say this trend is changing. So India has one of the largest number of widows in the world, according to 2011 census. 56 million widows, which is accounting of 78% of women. But what is most alarming, 0.45% of total widows are child widows in the age of 10 to 19 years. And as we all know that widowhood is marked by oppressive rights, mourning rights, and religious symbolism, particularly strict change in the diet and clothes. But for a specific age group, they face different kind of challenges. But most concerning is, despite the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act 2006, we have 1.94 lakh child widows. And they face lack of standardization in inheritance laws, no standard national skill development programs, and that's why it gives disincentives to remarriage. And the state level policies and programs for social security are not accessible uniformly to all widows, and because they are excluded due to age, income, or education. And for especially given that large number of illiteracy and low education, the paperwork is a real deterrent. So therefore, 78% in rural areas and 67% urban areas, their poverty level is high and low level of education skill. 35% of widows aged 15 and above only receive formal education. So there is absence of financial independence. So, and these are the impediments to remarriage. The child from a first husband decreases the likelihood of 43%. And woman with one son, then widowhood after the age of 40, disability and illness, then concern about the treatment of the children after remarriage, and losing inheritance rights, and most important, the very closed or negative attitude towards remarriage in the society. And because women are expected to be loyal to their deceased husband and the in-laws family even after their husband's death. And the stigma, I can give an example, the extent of what stigma, because they are considered in a very plain Bengali word, Shami Keko, that she has eaten her husband. So a very example I give of tiger widows of Sundarban. Why they're tiger widows? Because in Sundarban area, which is very, as I mentioned, that climate disasters are exacerbating the problem of this intersection of gender, climate change, and this is increasing the problem of widows. So impact of climate change on widows has been exemplified in Sundarban area, which is very vulnerable to climate change. And climate change is increasing the human-wildlife conflict. And as a result, when men, because of loss of livelihood, they are venturing to forests and for their livelihood to get wood, honey, and killed by tigers, it is the women who are blamed. So they are kind of tiger widows, and they are so stigmatized, and so they are not even allowed to pursue their livelihood in their own community. So option is migrating to cities or going to sex work or domestic laborer, so to live in dire poverty because of the stigma attached to widowhood, and something a folklore which really stigmatized these tiger widows. So it is said that because you are not pious enough, so that's why when your husband went to the forest, he was killed by tigers. So this is the extent of stigma. So how to expand the choices? I will keep it short. So because expanding the socio-economic marginalization is the key. And because we have already, Dr. Rai has already talked about the legal aspect, how inheritance rights are impacted, and how it can be improved. And most important, openness to society, and so comprehensive policy interventions on education, employment, social security, and the strict enforcement of the act. Especially, I will focus on Child Marriage Act, and because that has implications then on trafficking and child labor. So, and most important, widows organizing themselves for their rights. I'll quickly proceed to now Nepal, and there is 82.
So you have just 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes, okay. So Nepal has again, after a history of war, widows, because I will focus last at the Kenya because there's extent talk, so I'll more focus on Nepal, which hasn't been spoken about yet. So widowhood occurs at very younger age, primary reason being that decade-long civil war ended in 2006. No legal impediment to widow remarriage, because Nepalis is recognized the right of widows to pursue new relationships and marriages after the death of their spouse. However, because Nepali widows particularly experience discrimination, stigma, and social restrictions on behaviors, and especially sexual activity as a result of cultural beliefs, placing blame on widows for their spouse's death. And yes, studies say there is great potential to improve the quality of life through remarriage, but benefits, and especially among it has been, the study says the implications are the restriction are stronger on widows than widowers. But there is a study which discusses a lot about the white sari. So Nepali widows has especially explained that wearing that white sari makes them feel vulnerable because that isolates them in the public spaces. And so they rather not wear a white sari. And especially other studies have shown that the vulnerability of sexual abuse, because it says that a single woman, which means the back door is always open. So especially in the night, and sometimes in rural areas, because they have to go to long way for going to the toilet and all, so they're very vulnerable. So especially sexual abuse within the families, they're very, very, very scared about. But there are recent transformations of white sari transformations of women, and women have come together to celebrate Holi and try to discard the white sari and celebrating International Widows Day. And they are organizing themselves to secure this social transformation. And rather the war, because of the war, women, because of the missing men, they have now taken up new roles, which has made them empowered to become the head of the house and taking up new roles, which is giving in new roles and responsibilities and transforming their lives. So these are, as I discussed, the socioeconomic barriers, economic, social, and legal. These are some of the case studies. I do not have much time to discuss this. That widow is saying, oh yes, we have lost our husband, but don't we have the desire to dress or eat? So don't try to kill all this choice. No one should kill that. But Nepal has made considerable policy progress since 2005 to address this cultural stigma and achieve significant social transformation. Because Constitution Nepal as 2015 and Gender Equality Act reinforce inheritance rights and strong social security system and allowance for poverty alleviation and widows breaking traditions themselves. Kenya have already been discussed, multiple challenges, especially the widow cleansing rights and cultural, most important, the traditional beliefs supersede the law. So customarily beliefs superseding the law, especially in rural areas. Widow cleansing and the risks like property inheritance. So economic freedom still weak, land rights contested, enforcement uneven. These are some of the acts, succession which stripped widows of property, which has been challenged and which has been restored by the Constitution. There's some of the loan facility like Thamini loan facility for widows introduced in 2021, which has been comprehensive, supporting widows legally, economically, and socially. So therefore, conclusion is yes, legally there are rights, economically also there are rights, but real freedoms of women are constricted. So therefore, it is way to expand the choices, securing legal rights, enforcement of other economically poverty alleviation programs, securing financial independence, reducing stigma, building stronger safety nets, and simpler administrative changes tailored to each country's social and legal context. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. So, in spite of your bad throat, you made a very good presentation. I think after these three excellent presentation, I want, since we started 5-7 minutes late, I take just 2 questions from the participants. If you have anything very pressing, okay, go ahead. Somebody can, okay, you can speak in the mic, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Nandini Khandelwal, research analyst at ICWA. Thank you for this eye-opening session. My question is for Professor Mary. Now, since African countries are so rich in their culture, their tribes and communities, so my question is, to what extent can the defense of the cultural autonomy coexist with the efforts to ensure the rights and freedoms of widows? Can we really reconcile the preservation of these tribal community cultural autonomy while promoting women rights? Thank you.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think that's the dilemma. Sorry. So that's the dilemma I think most women are going through regarding wanting to embrace your culture and your values. And yet at the same time, we all know some of these values, they harm us. You know, I've done research a lot on other issues like female genital cutting, which all these issues are interconnected, you know. There are cultural practices that are good. I mean, culture is good because it gives us identity. It makes us who we are, and we want to embrace it, and we want to love it. But when it crosses the line where it exposes you to harm, it gets really difficult for a woman to negotiate that, especially when you come from a community with the worldview of corporate. You know, individualism doesn't exist. You know, it's the community that decides what they decide for you. It gets really difficult for you to negotiate your rights versus what the community expects for you. So what's happening to these widows mostly is what the community wants them to go through to protect everybody else from those impurities that come with death. And yet at the same time, you can actually see this woman is going through trauma. She's traumatized. How do you balance that? I think that's the moral dilemma that most cultures have. How do you balance that? I gave examples of Ghana, where the president came and sided with the widow. But in Kenya, the president sided with the man. Two different cultures, but you can see how even leaders of those communities cannot really make a decision, and it can be really difficult. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. Yes, one from the back. Okay, we'll take one more. So let's have one. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Bhashwati Thakurta from Center for Women's Development Studies. My question is to Saradamoyee Chatterjee, and I would like to ask about the context of tiger widow in Sundarban. Sundarban area is not only located in India, they have a part in Bangladesh. And we know that in Bangladesh there are Sharia laws follows, as it is an Islamic Republic. So widow remarriage, even after stigmatized as tiger widow, is it normal there? Because in Sharia, widow remarriage is pretty common. It is not like Hindu tradition. And number two, you talked about widows in different contexts in India, but there is another type which is known as half widow. They're from Kashmir, and their husband is suddenly disappeared and never came back. So what about them? I mean, if you study in that context, and if you study Bangladesh context, just let me know how tiger widows in Bangladesh, what is their situation about remarriage. I hope
Thank you. I think your
understand.
question is very clear. Yes, go ahead.
Actually, because the tiger widows are, there is a born baby kotha which is followed by both Hindus and Muslims both. And yes, definitely because Sundarban area overlaps with the border of India and Bangladesh. So the stigma, what I'm talking about, it's not the legal rights exist both in India and Bangladesh. I'm talking about the stigma because they're so highly stigmatized. They're considered so highly inauspicious, bad omen. That's why they're isolated. Well, remarriage is a choice, and that choice exists. But it's most of the time it's the social restrictions. So they are stigmatized because of it is folklore, the born baby's kotha, which is prevalent in the Sundarban area. I'm talking about the stigma, which restricts all aspect of their livelihood, social, economically, socially, both. Yeah, and these half widows you're talking about, yes, I haven't done extensive study in Kashmir, but Nepal, definitely there is still those missing person. Those both are Vojis commonality in both Kashmir, but there's missing persons widow. Do not even coming to tiger widows. Sometimes they hide the fact that they are widows because it's fearing the stigma. So yes, there is the missing persons cases are there also in Sri Lanka. So wherever the war, conflict, so it is an impact of conflict that they are neither widow nor a single woman. So somewhere in the middle, yes, they have different separate kind of challenges. Sometimes that can be an advantage, taking the advantage that they don't know that they're widow, and so economically they will not be disinherited or something.
Thank you. I think just one last question here. You raised your hand. Yes. Take the mic.
My question is with Rai Ganguly. You have presented very excellent presentation was, in fact, I should acknowledge it. Then you were talking about the 9 schedule state laws and how now 9 schedules empower state to frame its own land laws. And UP have framed its land law, and it is framed during the 2005 same period when Hindu Succession Act was reformed, and it is making a clear distinction between married daughters and unmarried daughters. Married daughters are being deprived from getting any kind of succession rights, and that married daughters also includes widowed, deserted, and like divorce to women. And another hand, Islamic law, which doesn't make any distinction between the married daughters or unmarried daughters, isn't it? It's a discriminatory against the married daughters, and regardless of their marital status. Another hand, there is a problem of in Hindu Succession Act, like making a will and depriving women in property rights. Like, we can see this case in ongoing case of Karishma Kapoor and Priya Kapoor case. So it is empowering interstate to dispose of his or her property through 100% giving rights to anyone as by depriving them. So there should be a limitation, like just like Islamic law, there is a 1/3 restrictions. No more than 1/3 property can be disposed of as per interstate. There should be a acknowledgement of natural inheritors, whether they are children, sister, daughters, widows, or.
Thank you for that question and your kind words. Yes, that seems to be the problem, because in every state, the agricultural tenant is defined separately, differently. So the Upzalra is the Uttar Pradesh Zamindari Abolition and Land Reforms Act. It defined tenants as separate, whereas the West Bengal Land Reforms Act did not mention the gender of an adult unmarried child. And an adult, because there is embargo on who the property can devolve to. In private property, the property will go according to intestate succession, which is what the Hindu Succession Act of 1956 governs. After 2005, it's not just intestate succession, it's also testamentary succession. Both come under the purview. But if I stick to the Land Reforms Act of West Bengal Land Reforms, it shows that the adult unmarried child is entitled to a separate 5 acres of land for a family of 5 persons. So it defines what a family is and who are the people who can inherit it. And this inheritance is simply on the basis of able-bodiedness. You can't leave the land fallow. You have to cultivate the land, and only then can you get access and the right to land. If you're not cultivating the land, a widow or even an adult male can be disinherited from it. So the inheritance principle, which is based on equality and who gets what within the family, is completely derided or overridden, in law at least, if not in practice as much. So, of course, there are overlaps, there are contestations, and what we understood from this presentation, all the presentations, is that like the customary law is usually adapted to suit, like even override the statutory laws. But the ultimate thing is, yeah, thank you. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. I think we can also have one-on-one conversation about what questions we have, but I am quite surprised no gentlemen have any question about this issue. It always happens that women are talking about their own problems to women only, and then other people don't feel concerned and considerate about it. So now let's say that very important point you raised about SDG 5, and also I'm thinking about, for now at least 5-6 decades, very actively we are talking about agency, we are talking about empowerment, and also we are talking about women's rights. Are we not? I mean, as a nation, as people, and also that we have to achieve the SDGs. Now we are coming very close to it. So SDG 5 talks about women's empowerment. So if we are looking at all this emerging and new framework within which we have to look at all these issues, then we cannot target a woman for impure body. I don't think any man has at any point of time impure body. Body physique that you want to purify by, and also because basically the idea is to control her sex and sexuality. That's what is the patriarchal control on women. They want to control her sex and sexuality. They feel that there'll be vulnerability, there'll be kind of, she is going to be available to a lot of men in the family. They want to make her available for other men in the family. So I think all these things are now very archaic, very ancient, and in the name of culture, we respect our culture, there is no doubt, but this is no culture. I think this is absolutely barbaric, brutal culture, part of our culture, to really discriminate the women the way we are discriminating. So we need a social reset. We need a cultural reset at this point of time if we really want to. And also we need to revisit our laws. And we have been talking about it for quite some time. I may sound very strong and very, but I think it's very, very important for everybody. It's not only for men and women, it's also for the next generation of young people who are getting quite upset and quite desperate about the way society is restrictive. A lot of young women are not willing to accept all this. You see, whether it is they are living in Town, because technology is reaching everyone and it's making everyone aware. Whether it is in Africa, whether it is in Asia, whether it is in India, any part of the world. So this needs to be reset. We do need to look for a new policy framework within the SDG, which really gives agency to women and not to be discriminated and targeted. And my only appeal, again, I want to repeat my professor's view, whom I respected a lot. I think it's just that as women and men researchers, we should look at and challenge the concept of widow as a conceptual way of, writing about a woman or talking about a woman. A single woman is, I think, is the more acceptable idea at every level, whether it is somebody by choice, by losing the man in life, or by whatever. The single woman is the only concept that should be acceptable to women, and not all these so-called traditional, archaic, tribal, barbaric way of targeting women and telling them and doing all kinds of things to women. Same things happens here also in India. Yes. They shave off the heads, they don't allow them to wear any clothes. So in a way distort her looks and her sex and sexuality. And do you know the fundamental principle of women's movement, feminism, is to have control over own body, sex and sexuality. Yeah. That's the fundamental, that's the first principle, and that's what we need to respect. And that is why I would think that you have done a wonderful job by revisiting this whole issue here, and with excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, speakers, for this insightful session and the enlightening case studies. We will take a 10 minutes, a 5 minutes tea break. Please be in your seats by 11 a.m. Thank you.